For 70 years, the engine of NATO air power has been American, not just in a figurative sense, but in a deeply literal, industrial, and geopolitical sense. Every major fighter jet that has defined Western air superiority, the F-16, the F-15, the F/A-18, and now the crown jewel of fifth-generation stealth aviation, the F-35, has been powered by engines built in the United States, supported by American logistics chains, and ultimately subject to the kind of political leverage that comes when one country holds the keys to an entire alliance's ability to fly and fight. That leverage has mostly sat quietly in the background, a kind of unspoken understanding between Washington and its partners. But in 2025 and 2026, that quiet understanding has been shattered, and what is now unfolding in Canada represents one of the most consequential defense pivot stories of the modern NATO era. To understand why, you have to start not with jets or engines, but with the political earthquake that reshaped Canada's entire strategic worldview. Since 2024, NATO has faced an unprecedented rift as U.S. President Donald Trump repeatedly threatened the sovereignty of two founding members, Canada and Denmark, proposing Canadian absorption into the United States and triggering a broader deterioration of the transatlantic relationship. For Canada, this wasn't simply diplomatic noise. It was an existential alarm. If the country that anchors your air defense system is also the country publicly threatening your sovereignty and annexing your territory in campaign rhetoric, then the question of who controls your fighter jets stops being abstract. It becomes urgent. And no question became more urgent than this one. What happens if the United States, in some future moment of political vindictiveness or strategic pressure, decides to cut off Canada's access to the systems that power its own air force? Canada's fear that the U.S. could effectively shut off its F-35 fighter jets through embedded architecture dependencies has become a real policy consideration in Ottawa. The F-35 is not simply a machine you buy and own freely. It is a networked, software-defined combat aircraft embedded in an American-controlled support architecture. Its mission systems, its data flows, its operational software updates, all of it runs through infrastructure that ultimately answers to Washington. Saab has proposed building a sovereign data center in Montreal, promising that Canadian mission data and software would remain under Canadian control rather than routed through the F-35's US-hosted support architecture. That offer landed in Ottawa not as a sales pitch, but as a mirror held up to a vulnerability Canada had long preferred not to look at directly. So here is where the story of the Gripen and the Rolls-Royce engine factory in Montreal becomes genuinely significant. Swedish aerospace firm Saab has confirmed negotiations with Ottawa and Bombardier over establishing Gripen fighter jet production in Canada, with company executives estimating the initiative could generate 10,000 jobs across manufacturing and research sectors. Saab President and CEO Mikael Johansson said, Canada could develop its own production capabilities for the aircraft if the government adds Gripens to the Royal Canadian Air Force fleet. And crucially, Saab is reportedly looking at switching to a Rolls-Royce engine in order to distance itself from U.S. influence over sovereign defense matters, with the company considering using Rolls-Royce engines that are made in Montreal. This is the pivot point that matters most in this entire conversation, because if the engine of the Gripen, the literal heart of the aircraft, is manufactured not in the United States under General Electric, but in Montreal under Rolls-Royce, then Canada doesn't just buy a jet. Canada becomes the industrial center of a NATO-aligned, non-American fighter ecosystem. Let that land for a moment. Currently, the Gripen E is powered by the General Electric F414 engine. It is a superb engine, battle-proven and reliable, but it carries with it the same strategic vulnerability as the F-35 system: American industrial dependency, American export control law, and potential American political leverage. Defense analysts have pointed out that whether the Gripen uses a Rolls-Royce alternative very much depends on whether Canada wants a genuinely U.S.-free product, noting that the opportunity exists now for Canada to start phasing out U.S. equipment where possible, given the increasingly volatile relationship with Washington. The Rolls-Royce engine being discussed for this variant drawing on work from the EJ200 family developed jointly with European partners, would represent a complete architectural break from American propulsion dependency. Canada wouldn't just be buying jets, it would be building engines, and it would be doing so in Montreal, inside Rolls-Royce Canada's established aerospace manufacturing infrastructure, leveraging decades of precision engineering expertise that already exists in that city's industrial base. On January 14, 2026, CBC News reported that Saab submitted a formal proposal to Canada covering 72 Gripen fighter jets and 6 GlobalEye airborne early warning platforms, stating that the purchase of this joint package could support an estimated 12,600 Canadian jobs. But the job numbers, while politically potent, actually undersell the deeper strategic implication. The real prize here is not employment. It is the industrial sovereignty that comes from controlling the production of a critical defense technology. When you build the engine, you don't just have a job, you have leverage, you have knowledge, you have the ability to sustain, upgrade, and export without asking permission from a foreign government. That is exactly the kind of capability that Canada has lacked for generations in its defense industrial base. The Carney government's defense industrial strategy aims to produce 70% of Canada's defense material domestically within a decade, backed by an $8.8 billion defense spending boost over the next 5 years. The Gripen with Rolls-Royce Montreal scenario slots perfectly into that ambition. It is not an off-the-shelf purchase. It is a national industrial strategy disguised as a fighter jet deal. And it connects directly to something much larger that is happening across the NATO alliance right now. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has warned that despite NATO's economy being 25 times larger than Russia's, Russia is producing 4 times more ammunition, and that NATO lacks sufficient air defense systems, long-range weapons, and combat-ready land formations. That production gap is the central crisis of the Western alliance in 2026. And the answer to that gap is not simply more spending. It is more distributed, resilient manufacturing capacity across multiple allied nations, so that a single political disruption in Washington cannot strangle the entire alliance's ability to rearm and regenerate combat power. A Gripen assembly plant in Canada, powered by Rolls-Royce engines made in Montreal, feeding jets not just to the Royal Canadian Air Force but potentially to Ukraine and other allied customers, is exactly the kind of distributed defense industrial node that NATO desperately needs. Saab's pitch includes potential output of more than 150 aircraft for Ukraine, using Canada as a production hub, and Canadian defense officials have signaled openness to diversifying purchases or joint ventures that support industrial growth while meeting defense needs. Ukraine's interest in the Gripen has been well documented. Kyiv wants a Western fighter it can actually receive, maintain independently, and operate without being trapped in the same American political approval matrix that has complicated every major weapons transfer to Ukraine since the war began. A Canadian-built Gripen, powered by a British-designed engine made in Montreal and exported to Ukraine, would represent a supply chain that is entirely outside American veto power. That is not a small thing. That is a structural shift in how the Western alliance can support democracies under fire without routing every decision through Capitol Hill. Now, it is essential to be analytically honest about what we know and what we don't. Canada actually already selected the Lockheed Martin F-35A Lightning II through the Future Fighter Capability Project, and the first CF-35A is planned for delivery to Luke Air Force Base, Arizona in 2026 for Royal Canadian Air Force training, with the first aircraft arriving in Canada in 2028. The Gripen story is not a done deal. It is a live political contest. Internal evaluation data showed the F-35 scored 95% versus 33% for the Gripen in Canada's fighter competition, with the former Royal Canadian Air Force commander stating that if pilots are sent into combat in an F-35 against Chinese or Russian jets in the Arctic, the aircraft scores 95%, while in a Gripen, it's 33%. That capability gap is real, and it is significant. The F-35 is a generationally superior aircraft in pure air combat performance. This is not in serious dispute among military professionals. The Gripen is an excellent 4.5 generation platform, but it is not a stealth aircraft, It does not have the sensor fusion of the F-35, and in a high-end threat environment over the Arctic against Russian fifth-generation fighters, that gap matters. Rising program costs, now estimated at $30 billion, have reopened the door for Saab's JS-39 Gripen E, which offers superior industrial benefits, including 12,600 domestic jobs and Arctic-optimized maintenance. The political calculus in Ottawa is therefore genuinely complex. On one side, you have the military argument. The F-35 is the better weapon, and Canada's primary obligation under NORAD is to defend North American airspace against the most capable threats Russia and China can field. On the other side, you have the sovereignty argument. An aircraft whose operational continuity depends on the goodwill of a country that has openly threatened to annex you is not actually a defense capability. It is a dependency. One scenario that has been floated is a partial fleet split, under which Canada would reduce its F-35 order and procure some Saab Gripen jets from Sweden to fill the gap, with Saab's chief executive saying in late March 2026 that the company could deliver Gripen jets to Canada within 5 years. A split fleet option is not as unusual as it sounds. Many NATO members operate multiple aircraft types across different mission profiles. Canada could theoretically maintain a smaller F-35 fleet for high-end contested air combat missions, particularly in the Arctic NORAD role, while using a Canadian-produced Gripen fleet for lower threat interceptions, maritime patrol, training, and allied export. This would give Canada the best of both worlds operationally, while also building the sovereign industrial capacity that the Carney government has made a cornerstone of its national security strategy. Saab has offered full technology transfer, source code access for mission systems, sovereign data control, and independent upgrade and maintenance rights as part of its Made in Canada proposal. No American defense contractor has ever offered anything remotely comparable. Lockheed Martin simply cannot offer what Saab is offering because the F-35 program is structured around the exact opposite philosophy: centralized American control of the platform's intellectual architecture. Canada spent more than $60 billion on defense in 2025, an amount equal to 2% of the country's gross domestic product, the highest level of defense spending relative to the size of the Canadian economy since the fall of the Berlin Wall. That is not a country in retreat from its NATO commitments. That is a country that has made a decisive turn towards serious defense investment, driven by a prime minister who understands that the post-Cold War era of cheap security and American patronage is over. Prime Minister Mark Carney argued at Davos in January 2026 that the world is in the midst of a rupture, not a transition, and that the old order is not coming back, outlining a Canadian foreign policy emphasizing cooperation with middle powers to resist pressure from great powers. That worldview directly shapes the Gripen question. If the old order is gone, then the logic that justified total dependence on American weapons platforms is also gone. Canada needs defense relationships that are resilient across a range of political scenarios, including scenarios where Washington is not a reliable partner. The Rolls-Royce Montreal engine story is, at its core, about building that resilience into the physical infrastructure of Canadian air power. An engine plant in Montreal doesn't just make engines. It makes Canada a node in a non-American defense industrial network that spans Sweden, the United Kingdom, and potentially the rest of the European NATO alliance. Canada's accession to Security Action for Europe makes it the first non-European country to be granted such a privilege, delivering on a government promise to integrate Canada into the European Union's Rearm Europe and Readiness 2030 plan. The Gripen Rolls-Royce arrangement would be the industrial manifestation of that political integration. Canada not just talking about becoming part of the European defense ecosystem, but physically building the hardware that sustains it. The question of whether Canada takes control of NATO through this maneuver is perhaps the most dramatic framing possible, and it requires careful qualification. Canada does not lead NATO, and a single engine factory does not reshape alliance command architecture. But what it does do is position Canada as an indispensable industrial partner in a NATO that is rapidly decoupling from exclusive American dependency. If Montreal becomes the production center for Gripen engines that power jets in Canada, Sweden, potentially Ukraine, and eventually other allied customers, then Canada acquires a form of industrial leverage within the alliance that it has never previously possessed. It becomes a source country, not merely a customer. It becomes a producer, not merely a consumer. And in a world where defense industrial capacity is recognized as a core element of strategic power, as NATO's own Secretary General has repeatedly argued, that matters enormously. The coming months will determine whether this vision materializes into policy. The Carney government has refused to set a deadline on its fighter review. The F-35 remains contractually committed for the first 16 aircraft. The political, military, and industrial arguments are all in active collision. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. Canada is looking at the world differently than it did 5 years ago. It sees a NATO that cannot count on Washington to be the permanent guarantor of alliance cohesion. It sees a defense industrial base that needs to be sovereign, distributed, and resilient. And it sees in the combination of the Saab Gripen, the Rolls-Royce engine, and the Montreal aerospace cluster a path toward a kind of strategic autonomy that Canada's founders of the alliance would find both surprising and entirely appropriate given the circumstances. The engine of change, quite literally, may be made in Canada.